Welcome to Chapter Chronicles. Today we will be reading Ranger's Apprentice, The Ruins of Gorlan by John Flanagan.
Try to eat something, Will. Tomorrow's a big day, after all. Jenny, blonde, pretty, and cheerful, gestured toward Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked at the plate before him, piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight, his stomach knotted tight with tension and anticipation, he could hardly bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew it all too well, in fact. Tomorrow would be the biggest day in his life, because tomorrow was the choosing day, and it would determine how he spent the rest of his life. Nerves, I imagine, said George, setting down his loaded fork and seizing the lapels of his jacket in a judicious manner. He was a thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, and with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful thing, nervousness. It can just freeze you up so you can't think, can't eat, can't speak. I'm not nervous, Will said quickly, noticing that Horace had looked up ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. On the other hand, he added, a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perceptions and sharpen your reactions. So the fact that you are worried, if in fact you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about of itself, so to speak. In spite of himself, a wry smile touched Will's mouth. George would be a natural in the legal profession, he thought. He would almost certainly be the scribe master's choice on the following morning. Perhaps, Will thought, that was at the heart of his own problem. He was the only one out of all the ward mates who had any fears about the choosing that would take place within 12 hours. He ought to be nervous, Horace scoffed. After all, which craft master is going to want him as an apprentice? I'm sure we're all nervous, Alice said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. We'd be stupid not to be. Well, I'm not, Horace said, then reddened as Alice raised one eyebrow and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Alice, Will thought. He knew the tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place as an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of Castle Redmont's diplomatic service. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out Horace's gaffe, showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately to the castle kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont's head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for the banquets served in the castle's massive dining hall. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his wardmate now, hungrily tucking into the roast turkey, ham, and potatoes that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age and a natural athlete. The chances that he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit that Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices. Strong, athletic, fit, and, thought Will, a trifle sourly, not too bright. Battle school was the path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners, but with the physical ability to serve as knights of the kingdom. Which left Will. What would his choice be? More importantly, as Horace pointed out, what craftmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was the pivotal point in the life of the castle boards. They were orphan children, raised by the generosity of Baron Arold, the Lord of Redmont Fief. For the most part, their parents had died in the service of the fief, and the Baron saw it as his responsibility to care for and raise the children of his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station in life wherever possible. Choosing day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards turning 15 could apply to be apprenticed to the masters of various crafts that served the castle and its people. Ordinarily, craft apprentices were selected by dint of the parents' occupations or influence with the craftsmasters. The castle wards usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or for whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to farming families in a nearby village, providing farm labour to raise the crops and animals that fed the castle inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen, Will knew. The Baron and his craftmasters usually went out of their way to fit the wards into one craft or another. But it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eye now and gave him a smug smile. "Still planning on applying for battle school, Will?" he asked through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. "Better eat something, then. You'll need to build yourself up a little." He snorted with laughter, and Will glowered at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had heard Will confiding to Alice that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life a misery ever since, pointing out on every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required of battle school apprentices. He'd hoped against hope for the past few years that he would have what people called his growing spurt before the choosing day came around, but it had never happened, and now the day was nearly here. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Will had clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will, although occasionally Will's speed and agility allowed him to get in a surprise kick or a punch and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. It was this tendency that often led to trouble between them. Will was yet to learn that having the last word was not always a good idea. Horace decided now to press his advantage. "You need muscles to get into battle school, Will. Real muscles," he said, glancing at the others around the table to see if anyone disagreed. The other wards, uncomfortable at the growing tension between the two boys, concentrated on their plates. "Particularly between their ears," Will replied, and unfortunately, Jenny couldn't refrain from giggling. Horace's face flushed, and he started to rise from the seat. But Will was faster, and he was already out the door before Horace could disentangle himself from his chair. He contented himself with hurling a final insult after his retreating wardmate. "That's right. Run away, Will No-Name. You're a no-name, and nobody will want you as an apprentice." In the anteroom outside, Will heard the parting sally and felt the blood rush to his cheeks. It was the taunt that he hated most, although he had tried never to let Horace know that, sensing that he would provide the bigger boy with a weapon if he did. Truth was, no one knew Will's second name. Nobody knew who his parents had been. Unlike his yearmates who had lived in a fief before their parents had died and whose family histories were known, Will had appeared, virtually out of nowhere, as a newborn baby. He had been found, wrapped in a small blanket, and placed in a basket on the steps of the ward building 15 years ago. A note had been attached to the blanket reading simply, "His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will." That year, there had been only one other ward. Alice's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in the battle at Hackham Heath, when Morgarat's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back to the mountains. Alice's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth. So there was plenty of room in the ward for the unknown child, and Baron Roald was, at heart, a kindly man. Even though the circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward of Castle Redmond. It seemed logical to assume that if the note were true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgorath, and since Baron Arold had taken a leading part in that war, he felt duty-bound to honour the unknown father's sacrifice. So, Will had become a Redmond ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others had gradually joined him, and Alice, until there were 5 in their year group. But while the others had memories of their parents, or in Alice's case, people who had known them and who could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. That was why he had invented the story that had sustained him throughout his childhood in the ward. And as the years passed and he added details and color to the story, he eventually came to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight warrior in full armor, fighting against the Wargle hordes, cutting them down left and right until he was eventually overcome by the sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured the tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and his equipment, but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. That was why selection for battle school was so important to Will. And that was why the more unlikely it became that he would be selected, the more desperately he clung to the hope that he might. He exited from the ward building into the darkened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. To do so would only lead to another fight between them, a fight that Will knew that he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, looking at both sides of the question and thoroughly confusing the issue. Alice and Jenny might try to comfort him, he knew, Alice particularly since they had grown up together. But at the moment he didn't want their sympathy, and he couldn't face Horace's taunts, so he headed for the one place where he knew he could find solitude. The huge fig tree growing close by the castle's central tower had often afforded him a haven. Heights held no fear for Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, continuing long after another might have stopped, until he was in the lighter branches at the very top, branches that swayed and dipped under his weight. In the past, he had often escaped from Horace up here. The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed in the tree, and he was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself in it, his body giving slightly to the movement of the tree as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds of the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open and, glancing down, saw Alice emerge, looking around the yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seeming to shrug, turned back and sighed. The elongated rectangle of light that the open door threw across the yard was cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle of soft feathers, and a barn owl landed on the next branch, its head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray of the faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear from him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. It swelled its head again, then launched itself off into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Gradually, as he sat there, the lights in the castle windows went out, one by one. The torches burnt down to smoldering husks and were replaced at midnight by the change of watch. Eventually, there was only one light left burning, and that, he knew, was the Baron's study, where the Lord of Redmond was presumably still at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure of the Baron seated at his desk. Finally, Baron Arald rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp as he left the room. heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was asleep, except for the guards on the walls, who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized, he would face the choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing the worst, he climbed down from the tree and made his way to his bed in the darkened boys' dormitory in the ward.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell notifications.